Thank you, Joe. In fact, I said to Anne, we won't have anything to say because Joe's going to cover the whole topic before we get there. But it's a delight and an honour to speak about Ken. Joe, unfortunately, used the past tense there, but Ken, I was with him last week, and he's as vibrant and as energetic and as enthusiastic as ever. And I know when we sat down in his home, and I said, "Are you still playing the piano, Ken?" And he didn't answer me. He stood up, went over to the piano, and we had a bit of a sing-song. So it just shows you at this age, and he is looking forward to his 99th birthday on the 8th of December. So take a note, everybody, and make sure he gets a card from you on that basis or whatever you do. I'm a little bit shy about speaking here.
You could have fooled.
But I wrote a book a few years ago called Crowning the Customer, and I found myself being invited to speak, usually at business sessions. And someone got in touch with me from the far side of Ireland to know would I speak at one of their regular monthly meetings, business meeting. And I was trying to fit it into my diary, and he came back and he said, "Oh, I forgot to ask you, what's your fee?" And I said, "No, you don't understand. I'm a grocer. I'm not a public speaker. I don't charge a fee." Oh, he said, "That's wonderful, because we hold these meetings regularly, and if the speaker doesn't charge a fee, the money we would have paid him, we put into a little kitty so that we can afford a good speaker every now and then." So you can see that on that basis, and our daughter, we have 5 children, but our daughter Gillian said to me, "Dad, if you're speaking, do always speak from a prepared script." And I don't really like, although I prepared something for Joe about Ken. And I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "Well, you remember when Orla, that's her youngest of her 4 children, the youngest was born, and I had phoned the hospital to know was there any word, and I was told great news that our daughter, Denise and our daughter Gillian had just given birth to a little baby girl." And I said, "That's great news, delighted to hear it, and tell me, are they both well?" And the nurse, mistaking to whom she was speaking, said, "Oh yes, the little girl is very well. That's 15 minutes ago. She's in great form. And your wife is well too." And I said, "Well, I should explain, I'm not actually the husband, I'm just the father." So you can see why Gillian says, "Dad, stick to a prepared script." But when Joe asked me to speak for a short few minutes about, and that means a short few minutes, which I thought I was going to be after Anne Chambers, I assumed I could criticise Anne and everything she'd said about Ken, but it's the other way around, so she can now criticise anything I said instead. But may I just say, I grew up in I was born in the 1930s, so I don't remember them at all. But when we look back on the 1930s, when Ken had already entered the civil service when he was only 18, 19 years of age, didn't go to university, entered the civil service, and came top of the class in almost every test, everything that he was asked to do. But if you picture the Ireland of the 1930s, the economic war, and then later the Second World War, and all of the problems and challenges that we had in Ireland, and our solution to them was to protect ourselves. Our solution was protectionism, put heavy tariffs on things coming in from outside. So I grew up in that Ireland of the late 40s, which was well protected. I can remember when my father came home one day with a banana, and I, as a little boy of about 10 years of age, went running into the house to get a knife to cut the banana. We'd never seen a banana on that base. And the amount of protection, it wasn't just bananas, but everything that we could have produced in Ireland was being produced in Ireland. Whether they were boxes of matches, whether they were bars of chocolate, whether they were packets of cigarettes. The whole idea was to protect ourselves, protect our jobs, and that's the way we would grow up. But of course we ended up with a very large emigration. and a very poor economy that just didn't seem to work very well. And I went to college in 1954 and did economics in college and commerce. And I know that of my class, when we left Newbridge, the vast majority of those in my class, I think almost everybody except myself, either was looking for a job in the civil service or a job in a bank or the insurance company, or they were joining the family farm. I think I was the only one who said, I'd love to think of going into business on that basis. But there was no support for that until out of the blue, suddenly, Ken Whitaker published his economic expansion plan. And that was in the mid-50s. And that changed the world. It certainly changed the world from my point of view. It changed the system that we had. And it was interesting that Sean Lemass accepted that Ken Whitaker could produce this plan, and the first economic expansion plan, could do it on the basis of under his own name. Now, Aaron will probably touch on this very much so, to say that he probably did that to protect themselves from any criticism, because this meant that so many of the jobs that we had created in Ireland, which were protecting ourselves, for instance, the cars, you couldn't buy a car in Ireland unless it was assembled in Ireland. Now, that was creating jobs. But picture what happened when Ken's proposal came forward and said, we're not going to protect jobs anymore, we're going to become outward looking and we're going to compete. And look at the success it has been since then. And that changed things quite dramatically. And he was just like a spark of delight to hear somebody like Ken Whitaker coming out, and somebody we didn't really know. We knew of him. He was very famous, very well known, very highly regarded by everybody. But those of us didn't get to know him. Those of us in business didn't certainly get to know him. And I can remember, just to give you one example of my situation, when, and at this stage I'd never met Ken, and I opened my first shop in 1960, and I was on the shop floor in our Sutton branch a few years later, and I saw Professor George O'Brien, who was the Dean of the Faculty of Commerce. Dean of the Faculty of Commerce in UCD, but I really hadn't got to know him in UCD to any extent. At least he hadn't got to know me. I got to know him. And I went up to him in the supermarket when I saw him doing his shopping. He was a bachelor and had come out to Sutton every year for a few weeks, and introduced myself to him. And he said, and what are you doing here? And I said, well, I'm working here. Oh, he says, oh, isn't that great? And what do you do? And I said, well, actually, I own the place. And he said, isn't that wonderful that one of my students has actually gone into business on his own? Now, it was so unusual for people to do that the vast majority, it was Ken Whitaker who changed the attitude, changed the beliefs, changed what happened. And then I met Ken in the 1970s. There were a group of people who got together. These were people in business, in other words, not in the state section, and those who were in the state, whether civil servants or semi-state bodies. And it was fairly clear that one group didn't understand how the others operated. And they decided to have meetings on a regular basis, and the meetings still go on. And Ken was one of those who joined that group, and I was then invited to join as well and got to know him. It was a very interesting group because that group had decided we won't have any politicians. But Garrett Fitzgerald was one of that group because he had joined before he became a politician. And Jack Lynch then later joined the group because he left after politics he joined. So you can picture this powerful little this powerful little group who met and talked on a regular basis and still do. But Ken was one of those. And it was such a, I see Don Thornhill smiling, remembering he's part of that group now. But it's just, it was a joy to meet Ken Whitaker and get to know him. And get to know him very well, because I remember he talked about the Seanad, and he was in the Seanad appointed by Jack Lynch, and later reappointed by Gareth Fitzgerald. And he said, and I hope I'm not cutting across something that Anne is going to talk about, but he said to Jack Lynch, listen, I don't know that I should do this because I don't always agree with you. And Jack says, that's why I want you in there. Not to agree with me, but to disagree on that basis. So we became good friends over the years, and I regularly drop into him. I'm not going to continue to talk about that anymore, except to say he is such a joy to meet, to listen to converse with. And when I got in touch with him at the time of the threat to the future of the Seanad, coming up to the referendum, and asked would he help become involved, because he had been a senator for 2 different terms, and he was willing to give his name to a letter to the paper along with some others at the very beginning, but then said, no, I don't think so. I think as a former civil servant, I shouldn't be seen to be taking sides in a political issue. And so he stayed back and said, no, I won't go public on this, but you can take it that I support the concept of what you're doing, and hopefully to do so. So we meet, he's come into the Seanad with me and met some of my university senators and others in there, and we've had some very good meetings. He's been out, as Joe said, out to our home, Denise and I and Vincent O'Doherty was there for lunch one day, and I can remember that particular day, his daughter-in-law, Teresa, was there, and Denise's conversation was that her mother had died in her 102nd year and had played the piano right up to the time she died. And Teresa said, but Ken plays the piano as well. And he took us into the room next door, and we had a sing-song with Ken and the group of us who were there. And this was at 98 years of age. So it is just a joy to think that somebody is able to set such an example, having made dramatic changes. If I talked to Vincent Doherty earlier on about Ken, and he said, of the people who we could compare Ken to, probably the one that jumps to mind of somebody who actually changed the world. And you talked about Jacques Delors as a very good example. Ken changed the world in Ireland, and he changed it. And what's interesting is that he changed it with the enthusiasm, with the commitment, with the energy to be able to achieve that. And I think he has done a marvellous job, and we're delighted to be able to speak about it here today. Let me finish with one little topic, and that is a man I met in Japan some years ago called Ito-san. Ito-san is a very successful Japanese businessman, and he's in the supermarket business, and he came to see us in Ireland and went around our supermarkets, he and his wife. And as we got into the car in Blackrock to drive over to Howth for lunch, he said to me, Fergal, how many supermarkets have you got, and when did you start? And this was 10, 12 years ago. I said, well, I started in 1960 with one shop. And we now have, I think, 22 supermarkets at that stage. And I said to him, and tell me, or he then said, in 1960, I too had one supermarket. He had started in 1952, and he opened his second supermarket in 1962. So he had one supermarket, and I had one supermarket at that stage in 1960. And I said, and tell me, Ito-san, how many supermarkets have you got now? And he checked with the interpreter. I was driving, the interpreter was there beside me. And he said, how many have we got? And the figure was 14,700. But I said to him, Ito-san, what was it that made you different from all of those others? That they have, they've still probably got one shop in a supermarket, but you've now got 14,700 or 14,900, whatever it was. And he said, let me think of that answer. And as we got out of the car in Howth, he said, and he gave me a quote, which is, I'm not sure who's the original quote from, but it's a quote he likes. And he said, whether you believe you can or whether you believe you can't, you're right. Now, I think Ken Whitaker was exactly that sort of person who said, I believe we in Ireland can. And because he committed himself to that, because he showed that enthusiasm, because he showed that commitment, and because he was able to convince Ireland that this was the right way to go, I think that's the reason we have an Ireland that we have today. Thank you very much.